Our next presentation will be by Stephen Miller, who is the Director of the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit, or AGBU. Steve is originally from Canada and has 25 years of experience across a diversity of roles and continents, including the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, in livestock genetics, genomics, and technology. Steve will be taking us on a review of the gain the Australian sheep industry has made to date and how recording and genomics have underpinned this process, as well as discussing the need and challenges around continued recording in the genomics era. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Emma. Hear me okay? I think I'll start with the title, actually. It looks like a pretty clever title, and that's because I didn't write it. So I was given the title. It does look somewhat familiar to me because I've used the term genetic engine before, and actually PETA used it in her presentation today. And I want to dive into that a little bit about, just what is this genetic engine that us as scientists talk a little bit about. So I thought I'd start with what is an engine to begin with. And I thought this picture was a little bit fitting because it's right there in Melbourne with a steam engine. But if we think about before the steam engine, we basically had animal draft power. And then we developed something where you could take wood or coal and burn it and create steam. And then you could create power in the terms of moving wheels that can pull that train down the track. And so if you look up a definition of an engine, you get something like it's a machine for converting any various forms of energy into mechanical force and motion. So that's what an engine is, but what's this genetic engine that we talk about? And so using the same definition, I've embellished it a little bit to redefine it as a genetic engine. It's a system for converting any various forms of information into decisions influencing genetic change. So you as breeders and the industry supported a lot of work to collect a lot of information. But you as breeders, we need to have an engine that's going to take all that information and turn it into something that you need. So the steam engine, takes a piece of wood and turns it into moving wheels. This genetic engine needs to take information that you collect in the form of phenotypes, genotypes, and pedigree, and actually turn it into information that you can use to make selection decisions. And your progress in terms of work is not wheels rolling down a track, but actually change in the animal's genetic merit. And across the bottom there, we'll dig into them a little bit more later, is your genetic trends in merino sheep and maternals and terminals. So as here at AGBU, I guess if I go back to the title of the presentation, what's coming that's going to change our genetic engine. And so let's consider engines over time. We moved from a steam engine, which I guess you could call as an external combustion engine, to an internal combustion engine, and with a Model T Ford, say, and now we have at the bottom left-hand corner there, the 2023 Hilux. And you might look at the Model T and the Hilux and say, well, that's quite a change. But from a technological point of view, there hasn't really been a whole lot of change. It's still an internal combustion engine. It still you still pour petrol in the tank. You still have spark plugs. It turns a shaft and turns the wheels. We really haven't changed it all that much. But there's a big change moving from a steam engine to the internal combustion engine and then through to potentially a electric vehicle, which I don't know if you call that a non-combustible engine, I suppose. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But as a scientist, what is coming that's going to change this genetic engine that might influence you as sheep breeders? And this year, in 2022, there was what they call the World Congress for Genetics Applied to Livestock Production. It's kind of like the Olympics of animal breeding. It's held every 4 years, and it was held in Rotterdam in the Netherlands here last July. And for those of the scientists that didn't have COVID or didn't get COVID while they were there, they enjoyed a great conference. But it's actually a time where scientists get together, and for me, it's always, it's where you kind of got your ear to the ground, and everyone presents their best stuff, and you get to hear around the world kind of what's coming. And I guess I'm here to tell you, as far as what's going to influence your sheep genetic evaluation, it's kind of, there's no big step change coming. right? We're not going from the steam engine to the internal combustion engine. We're not going from the internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. So that sounds a little bit ho-hum, but I think I'll get back to it here in a minute, but that is actually, I think, an important message. Because as I see it, you've already gone through a major change. You've moved from the steam engine to the internal combustion engine here just recently with the development of genomic selection. And I've got an Illumina chip up here. It doesn't matter too much to you as sheep breeders, but there's Affymetrix technology and genotyping technologies can deliver genotypes now as well. But in 2005, when this was launched, in dairy cattle implemented genomic selection in 2009, and on the sheep and beef side of things, the scientists were sitting here as an industry saying, well, look what they're doing in dairy cattle. Can we do the same thing in sheep or beef cattle? And today, I think all the above is history. You are doing it, and Peter's done a great job showing the gains that have been made. And I won't, they'll allow me to go a little bit faster through these slides because she's covered a lot of it. But the increase in genomic testing has been phenomenal. And the increase in genetic progress, which we'll talk about here in a minute, has also gone up, as has done recording. So if we look at the increased rates of genetic gain, it's interesting to look at how much progress we're making pre-genomics, and Peter's showing some of this, and post-genomics. And if you look at the index trends there, and Andrew Swan has put these slides together, this is our rate of gain in recent times, and this is our rate of gain kind of 2011 to 2016. And you'll see roughly a 50% or so increase in progress over that time period. And we could say, well, that's kind of coincides with genomics and implementation of genomic selection, but that's not all that it coincides with. And there's quite a few factors that have come together that enabled more progress. And so if we start at the, most importantly, it's around the data. That we can't actually fuel this genomic engine, if you want to call it that, without the data. And so the investments that MLA and others have made into these resource flocks, and I know Julius is going to talk more about that in a special session, but they are really what enables the accuracy that we get with genomic selection. Full single-step analysis. So if I think about when they went to full single-step, you now have the most up-to-date internal combustion engine available to you as breeders, and it's a matter of you to get out there and use it and make the most of it. Things like this DNA stimulation project has actually got breeders genotyping, and although as a percentage of maybe the 300 and some thousand genotypes in merinos today, it's a small percentage, but it actually probably kick-started breeders into trying it and showing that it works, and then continuing with it and being leaders in the industry. As far as sheep goes, it's a little bit different than in beef cattle, but one of the big advantages of the genomic testing is you actually get a much better pedigree. So the actual mothering up of lambs with ewes is fixed for you through genomics. So that's been a big plus for genetic progress. And then Peter talked about new breeding objectives and getting all the economically important traits, including some of these hard to measure traits like reproduction and meat quality, all into your index is also really important. So Peter showed this nicely in a couple of graphs, but she said, well, we didn't talk about the lean meat yield story, but maybe I could just emphasize that here. But these graphs basically show the same story that Peter was talking about in terms of we've got eating quality here along with lean meat yield. And if I can get my pointer to work, that turnaround that Peter already showed you here in IMF, so it was going down, lean meat yield was going up. And at this stage here with dedicated recording and resource flocks, we were able to turn that around. So shear force improved, IMF improved, but lean meat yield is still increasing, which is great. So you can say, well, that coincides with genomics, but it's not just genomics. There's a whole suite of things that come together to make that happen. And the one is the reference population, meat science, and Pete McGilchrist is going to be here, and we're going to see some of the work that they do, bringing that research together, the testing breeders do, all that into single step, and then a breeding objective that puts weighting on those traits. So I think that's actually a great story for the industry and a great accomplishment. So we've turned a corner really in breeding, and I think as breeders you should be really excited to think about you've lived through maybe one of the big turning points in breeding. When the genomic selection was first implemented in dairy cattle, the term that people would say was it's the biggest invention since frozen semen and artificial insemination in dairy cattle back in the 50s and 60s. So it's been huge, and not only in sheep but also in beef cattle and dairy cattle, pigs, poultry, what have you. It's been a major turning point. So as a breeder, it might all seem a little bit magic, but in reality, we need these reference populations. We can then use that to come up with a prediction that we can use on young animals to get an accurate prediction with just a DNA test. And we might say, well, that seems a little bit magical, that we can, we're not actually going to phenotype these animals, we can just genotype them. I think the question earlier was about DNA-only products. We're just going to genotype an animal, we're going to get a breeding value estimate and rock on. That seems a bit magical, but it's, I guess I'll go back to kind of my physics class back in high school, where energy can't be created nor destroyed. It all's coming from somewhere, and so we don't get this prediction accuracy from nowhere. It's got to come from somewhere. And my predecessor at AgBoo was a fellow by the name of Rob Banks, so I'm sure if I had to show of hands, there'd be lots of people in here that know Rob. But we got discussing this somehow over. He doesn't use the retirement word, but for a guy that doesn't work for a paycheck anymore, I get lots of emails and texts from Rob, so we keep in contact quite a bit. But we got into a discussion one day, and Rob actually put this forward as an analogy, and I think it's a really good one. Comparing genomic selection today with really the energy industry and renewable energy and these types of things. So I've got a lot of car and truck analogies today, by the way, maybe more of those than sheep. But if we look at vehicles, if you think back to the internal combustion engine days, we burn fuel and move the car down the road. But now I can buy this electric car. I don't burn fuel anymore, and I go down the road. Isn't that amazing? But it's not that amazing, because the energy to move you down the road actually came from somewhere. And it actually comes from power that's generated in some other way. Could be a coal-burning power station, could be wind, could be solar, could be green hydrogen, or what have you. So the point is, it's not magic. The power comes from somewhere. And just like genomic selection in sheep, in the old days we had sheep, we wanted to select them, we had to measure them, and that gave us estimates of their genetic merit. Well, today we could just genotype that sheep, and that might seem like magic, but in reality the power of that genotype, that genomic prediction, is coming from somewhere. It's coming from lots of other sheep, thousands of sheep that are measured and genotyped, and that's where the power of that tool comes from. So with this game-changing tool, what opportunities does that open up for the industry? And you're already capturing a lot of these. But the one is, we can now target really the commercial industry really for data. That within the seed stock sector, that's where the sheep have been historically that we've been measuring. But we don't necessarily have to be limited to that anymore, because we can actually measure commercial animals for commercial traits and commercial environments and use that to fuel our genomic predictions. We also can focus more on hard-to-measure traits. If we go back to carcass traits, in sheep, we're going to measure them with ultrasound to come up with a prediction of carcass merit on those animals based on their own records. Well, are we better to do that, or are we better to get some really good carcass data on commercial animals that are genotyped to drive our genetic predictions? So we can focus on some hard-to-measure traits like carcass and meat quality, fertility, health. And I know Daniel's going to talk about emissions and those types of traits, which everyone will be really interested in later. So as Peter said, I haven't been at AgBoo forever. I've been there about 2.5 years. My previous job to that was here with the American Angus Association, working with these people here. And I'm going to show you some results from Angus, because I think it's always interesting to look over the fence and see what's happening in other places. American Angus Association is in Missouri in the USA. They claim to be, and I haven't found anything to indicate that they're not, the largest beef breed association in the world. They register about 50% more animals than is in all of breed plan for all the breeds in Australia. So it's a big analysis. And I think as sheep breeders, what can we learn when we have experience in these other places, that that some of these problems and things show up by others. And so this is all about, I want to make a message here about phenotyping and the need for recording. You'll see each of those traits, so they got millions of records for a lot of traits. There are over 1 million animals genotyped in the population now. When I first looked to take the job with them in 2016, they had 250,000 genotypes. So that's kind of where merinos are today, at about 300,000. So then, forward on here, whatever it is, 6-7 years, and well over 1 million genotypes. And so the question is, if we were having this discussion with American Angus and their board members at the time that I left, one of the big questions was, people are starting to stop recording, right? So at one stage, they were bringing in about 120,000 ultrasound records per year for carcass traits. They're now down under 80,000. That's quite a drop. And why would that be? Well, they can actually get a very accurate breeding value now just with genomics. And if they phenotype their animals on top of that, the accuracy really doesn't go up hardly at all. So why would you go through the expense and the risk of breaking a bull's leg or something like that to do the phenotyping? And so there's obviously, I told you before, we can't do genomic selection without the data. And so there's a saw-off here within the decisions have to be made. How do we keep the phenotyping going in light of really accurate genomic predictions? Because what I would say to the board members is, this is not a problem. In a way, you've arrived. This is, we've been pushing for accurate genomic breeding values for some time. Now that you get here, you did it with data. So if you pull your foot off the data, we're going to start to slide back in terms of prediction accuracy. And I think that's the sheep industry here in Australia will face these same questions. In American Angus, pre and post genomics, again, increasing progress. Just the story around over 1 million genotypes, I think I split this out here by sex, bulls and heifers. And I think it's an important message because they're genotyping a lot of heifers as well as a lot of bulls. Maybe a bit more bulls than heifers, but still there's a lot of heifers being tested. So it's just not a marketing tool. In the early days of genomics, guys would genotype their bulls or maybe their rams to have the breeding values, but it was a bit of a marketing tool. Were they actually using it for selection? And now there's about 2/3 of the animals in total are genotyped. And if you look at merinos in Australia, we're pushing the same level. But it's great to see females genotyped as well as males, because then you realize the breeders are actually interested in using it as a tool for selection within their herds. It's not necessarily just for marketing. I'll put this next one up for Rob Banks as well. He interviewed us at American Angus for a chapter he was writing for a manuscript, and we talked about the impact of genomic selection in Angus. And he was interviewing groups around the world, and he asked a question. He says, "So have you seen the average age of the parents decreasing with genomics? So if you get an accurate breeding value on a bull at a young age, you don't have to wait till he has carcass data anymore. You can use them right away." And so, well, we hadn't looked at it, but I did after that. And this is the graph we see there. So if you look at the blue line, you'll see genomics basically came in that population in 2010, and you'll see that average age of those males is dropping in the population. And so carcass traits are really important. Marbling's really important in the breed. At that stage, pre-genomics, well, am I going to use this young bull based just on his own scan, or am I actually going to wait till he's got some carcass records, see how he is for marbling before I really use him heavily? And what we see is people now are leaning more and more towards the genomic data and moving on with a bull. And you can see that in the bulls that different studs have available, or the AI studs have available for sale. Something else that I think is important is this is around some index values on females. And there's two lines there. The one is, they're pretty similar lines. The one is increasing net merit over time, but the other one is the standard deviation of the index. And why is that important? The bigger the standard deviation, the more variation we have. And what we see here is that the standard deviation is increasing because breeders are measuring more things. There's more things in the index. There's structural traits like feet and legs, fertility, docility, in the index now, and breeders are actually measuring those things and genotyping their females, which is spreading out the breeding values more, and you're better able to identify those elite females, and that ties into embryo transfer programs and in vitro fertilization, which is becoming very important on the cattle side. So that is, I guess, another kind of synergistic tools around reproductive technologies and genomics that's going to fuel progress into the future in those breeds. So this is a little bit of either a spoiler alert or a little taster for, I'm giving a presentation in July for the AAABG conference, which will be in Perth, and this is one of my slides I had in the paper. So I thought I'd kind of leak it out ahead of time for maybe a lot of you probably won't be there. But this is genetic progress in dairy cattle, sheep, and beef cattle. So we've got your Holstein Friesian index for Australia. You've got our Angus all-purpose index, Merino MPP, all on the, I've tried to standardize them all on a common scale. And what you see here is post-genomics, the dairy indexes. These are kicking up, like we showed earlier for sheep. They are kicking up by that 40 to 50%, but the dairy is really taken off. And I guess as a breeder, as an industry, I think we could look at that and say, well, the ceiling is still a ways ahead of us, I think, here as breeders for using this technology and increasing our gains. The dairy industry had one, in a way, they had one kind of big Achilles heel that they could overcome with genomics, and that was the age of the sires when they could use them. Because obviously bulls don't produce milk, and the only way to evaluate a bull for milk is to wait till his daughters are actually producing milk, in which case he's getting pretty old. But now we can take that young bull calf, pull a DNA sample and say, okay, we're going to collect semen out of that bull, and we're not going to wait for his daughters. And so they've dropped that generation interval quite a bit. And we don't have the opportunity to do that as much in sheep and beef cattle. So maybe we won't attain that kind of a gain, but I think there's other things that are happening here, just like it is in sheep. It wasn't just genomics, it was what they were measuring, what they had in the breeding objective, and they have new traits in terms of fertility in their breeding objective, and they've turned fertility around just like you've turned meat quality around in sheep. So if I go back to this graph, getting ahead of myself, that scientists, I've heard it called a broken stick graph, where you're going along at a certain stage and then the stick breaks and it looks like this. But I always thought that was a little weird, because in Canada we never called it a broken stick graph, we always called it a hockey stick graph. Because our hockey sticks look like this, but I realized in Australia you wouldn't call it a hockey stick graph because it'd look really funny with that curve on the end of it. But that's essentially what we want as breeders, right? We want to say we're making this kind of progress today, but how do we really ramp that up? And so if I come back to my car analogy, and I'm just going to focus in on internal combustion engines for now, I'll say with single step we have we've given you an internal combustion engine and you're off and running. But there's a lot of scope between that one and that one. And where on this continuum are we? You know, I'd say I think that was an F.J. Holden in 1962, if the label in the internet is correct, but someone can tell me if it's wrong. But I'd say maybe the sheep and beef industry is somewhere in here, and maybe the dairy industry is somewhere in here. They've still got a ways to go, and I think sheep and beef have got a ways to go as well, with the technology that you have. So what's going to power our genetic engine for the future? I guess I go back to my definition, and the definition is this engine needs to basically combine all these various forms of information into something that you can use, and that's essentially what we at AgBoo focus on. But in the future, it's going to be based on more powerful information, which is going to be more phenotypes, more genotypes. You know, I think that 1 million might seem like a long ways off, but I can tell you it'll be here before you know it, that you'll have 1 million genotypes in your Merino evaluation. More traits, which means for the industry and you as breeders, more work, which means for us, more research. And we need to develop a system that's going to handle all that. And that's a little bit us taking that F.J. Holden and making it into that Hilux. You know, we need to put in the fuel injection and the electronic ignition and everything else. So I'm going to wrap up with this slide, but I'm going to ask my colleagues in AgBoo to actually everyone stand up for just a minute. In case they didn't hear me. Because I want the breeders to actually look around at the people from Agbu. Because I've been at events like this. I guess you can sit down now. And I should have said we got visitors from France and other places that could have stood up as well. But the point is, as breeders, as we build this genetic engine, I've been in meetings like this in other species with breeders like yourselves, and quite often a conversation starts with a breeder coming to me and they say, "Have you ever noticed blah?" And then as a scientist you say, "Hey, wait a minute, I think you might be onto something there," and because under the hood you know what might be happening, and then that leads to a research project, and that actually leads to a better genetic engine 3 or 4 years down the track. So I guess I encourage you as breeders, talk to the scientists. If you got an idea, if you got have you ever noticed when idea, please bring those up, because I think that's a big part of what this is all about, and actually fueling our genetic engine for the future. Because I see it as Agbu, that genetic engine that we talk about is the engineers that designed that engine are right here with you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to put faces to what Agbu is. In the sheep genetics team, we are hassling those guys all the time, so they hear a lot from us, but it's great to be able to have them all here today and tomorrow. In terms of questions, the first one off the bat is, as we get more pressure on genomics and indexes, we are seeing that genetic diversity is being limited. How can we get around this?
Yeah, that question comes up quite a bit. And actually we're going to hear from Brian Kinghorn later in the program about mate cell. So there are tools to help you preserve and work with the genetic diversity in mating programs. I will at American Angus, we actually did a study looking at diversity pre and post genomics and the influence of genomics on diversity. And actually what they found was the diversity is actually increased. And you wonder, well, how could that be? And it's actually because now you've got more accurate information in more studs, in more places. And there's a lot of AI that's used. In fact, in Angus, I think we're up to 60% of the calves born are through artificial insemination. So that leaves you with 60% of the calves born actually are limited by what are the AI studs out there, what are they buying? And before, without genomics, without a lot of information, they'd go back to the same cow families all the time. Here's a bull that sold really well. He was out of some cow. Well, if I could get another son out of that cow, I can actually market it. Well, that's not a lot of information, actually, and it's actually not great for diversity. Whereas now we can actually genotype lots of animals, so genomics could actually be used to increase your diversity instead of identifying one great ram and then flogging him really bad. So the tool, the genomics could actually be used to increase the diversity, but it's how you actually select to mate the animals, and I think it'd be good to hear from Brian on where mate cell would play a role in that.
If we get to a stage where we can produce genotype-only breeding values, what portion of animals will still need to continue to measure phenotypes on?
Yeah. It's another really good question. As far as proportion-wise, I go back to that Angus example. People are worried because we've gone from 120,000 phenotypes a year down to 80,000. Most of those animals are genotyped. Well, 80,000 animals a year coming in that are phenotyped and genotyped is still a huge reference on top of the million animals that they have. So the reality is we don't need the level of recording that we had to get to where we are now. I think if you were a company, let's say, and you kind of owned all of Australia, you would say, here we need phenotypes on these animals, and there's going to be high quality phenotypes that are going to fuel this genomic engine. And there's going to be a bunch of breeders that you don't have to collect phenotypes anymore, and that's actually that system would be okay. Obviously, that seems like a real big stretch because we don't own Australia, and it doesn't operate that way. But I think the reality is we still need to keep that reference population up to date with really good high quality phenotypes. The numbers that are required, people are working on that, but I'm not going to give you a number right now.
No worries. We'll take one last one. We've got one here. How accurate are current genomics at identifying lifetime productivity and performance? Is it something that we see in other breeds that's being well captured?
Yeah, I guess if I go back to the cattle example, and you'll quickly realize when Andrew and Daniel get up here and speak later, they're subject matter experts in sheep, and I'm not. But if I want to lean on my cattle, if this was a bunch of cattle breeders, they would say, if we were to rank the traits that they're interested in, it is around longevity and female productivity traits. And really it comes down to recording. So in cattle, for example, we've got breeding values for feet and legs. We got breeding values for fertility. We have breeding values for docility. And when you do a survey of breeders and you say to them, or you even look at the culling codes, what are the top reasons that cattle leave the herd? Fertility, feet and legs, docility are at the top of the list. So we have component breeding values for those traits, but then we need the people to be measuring those traits. And if we go back to that Angus slide, you'll see those traits have actually come on later in life, and so there's still tens of thousands of records, but they're not millions. And so for breeders to really get at those traits, actually have to measure those components.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. I'll leave you
Okay.
to get back to your seat.
Thank you.
Just one round of applause for Steve, please.